Hello, I am the Reverend Douglas Taylor, and I welcome you to the final session of Theological Plurality in our congregations. It is the sixth of the videos that I have made, the ninth and final session in this program. If you have a chalice or a candle with you as we begin our time together, I invite you to light that as I offer some words to frame our time together. These are from Suzanne Meyer. We together today, not because we expect to find answers here, but rather because we expect to be encouraged in our questioning. We come together today, not because we expect to find perfect people here, but rather because we hope to find authentic people here. We come not because we are certain of our own righteousness, but because we are continually searching for the right, the good, the uplifting. We come together today not because we seek absolution for our sins and failures, but rather because we acknowledge our imperfections and seek the courage to make amends for those failures to ourselves and others. We come together today not because we need to be told what to believe and how to act, but rather because we need each other's encouragement to act according to our own best beliefs. We come together today not because we are hoping to find God in a scripture or in a ritual, but rather because we are hoping to discover the divinity within each of our hearts, and within the hearts of others. We come together today not because we believe that holiness exists within these walls alone, but rather to have our hearts and minds directed to the holiness in the world. For all of these reasons, we come together today. Building our shared theology, that is the title of this final session that we have been working our way through. We will be having a final process circle together on December 8th. We will send out notice for everybody who is participating so they have an opportunity to join into the conversation and discuss any final thoughts that they have with all of this. So our topic today, building our shared theology. It's rather the topic that has been throughout all of the previous sessions as well. The piece that I really want to focus on today is something that I heard come up in conversation through our process circles over the past sessions. People were wondering if there might be tools and resources at their disposal for how to have that conversation with people about what is Unitarian Universalism, what do Unitarian Universalists believe, how do you articulate that, and really dig in to the conversations that arise, whether they're with families or with strangers on the street or friends and coworkers who are curious. One of the things that I have noticed is that it's good to have more than one way to answer that question. Unitarian Universalism. It's not only good because there's always a variety of ways in which the question comes up, but it's also good because Unitarian Universalism is a complex and nuanced faith tradition. It doesn't offer a quick soundbite type of answer. And so it's unrealistic for us to find a single definitive answer. And it's hard, not because Unitarian Universalism is vague or contrived or non-existent, that it doesn't have a... It's because it's complex. It's difficult to articulate because it's a complex faith tradition. So this is because we're always evolving. Unitarian Universalism looked differently in the 60s. It looked differently at the turn of the 1900s. It looked different in the middle of the 1800s. It looked very different at different times throughout our history as Unitarians and Universalists. We grow as people. and who we are grows with us. Our capacity to answer the question, what is Unitarian Universalism, is something that needs to be fresh with each generation. It's become to me because I've grown up into this tradition, and it's one that I value. And so I've asked that question, and I've listened to people, listened to my colleagues, listened to lay people, and so over the years I've heard a lot of answers for what is Unitarian Universalism, and I've developed a little bit of a list because I do that kind of a thing. I like to categorize stuff, and so this is one of the things that I did. I categorized 7 different ways to answer the question, what is Unitarian Universalism? So I have a list, and I'll include that later on, but let me start with this 7th style. It's unfortunately very common, but it's got a lot of problems to it. So when people say, what is Unitarian Universalism? One of the things that we do is we answer the question by saying what we're not. Well, we're not exactly Christian. I find myself answering people to say, well, we do not take the Bible literally. We honor it as a sacred text, but it's not something that we read as a literal word of God. So that's telling somebody what we're not. We say that we don't have dogma. We're non-creedal. That people come to Unitarian Universalism because of what we're not, which is a terrible way to define our tradition. You know, a Buddhist does not say, well, the first thing you need to know about Buddhism is that we don't believe in the Tao, or we don't believe in the Hindu gods. You know, nobody does that. Christianity does not begin by saying, well, we don't really talk about Allah. Instead, we talk about this thing or the other thing. But Unitarian Universalists have this propensity for saying what we're not. Partly that's a thing we do because of the dominant culture around us, and so we're responding to this assumption that a lot of people have. And in some ways, this is a good thing to do because people will often ask the question, what do Unitarian Universalists believe? And there really isn't any way to answer that except with this method. Well, Unitarian Universalists as a group don't believe a thing. We are non-creedal. We don't gather around beliefs. We have a different way of being together. And so in some ways this is actually an authentic way to answer. And so I'm not saying that it's wrong and you shouldn't do it. What I would suggest might be that you use it as a beginning and move into one of the other styles as well for somebody. Let me also say this is a great way for atheists to hear about Unitarian Universalism, because most atheists who don't yet know about Unitarian Universalism think that all religions are like, theist, Bible-thumping religions, that it would exclude them. And so to say that, God is not mandatory, there's a plurality here, is something that an atheist would benefit from hearing. But again, I would say it would be good to use this one as an opening, but not leave it as the only way that you define who Unitarian Universalists are. So the next one that I want to mention is to talk about your personal experience. When I ask a circle of people, like, tell me about Unitarian Universalism, this is actually the one that comes up most often. People will say, when I come to this community, it looks like this. Or, it's here that I am accepted. We come together for the community because when we're together we sing and there's a lot of joy, or we get to really wrestle with ethical questions and to do some activism to make the world a better place. This personal experience, this is what it's like for me when I'm here in this community. When someone wants to know what is Unitarian Universalism, this can be a valid way to say this is what this particular community is like, and you should come and try it. It's an invitation. And so this is another method. Now, it doesn't tell anybody about the history of Unitarian Universalism or our theology, but it can open up the conversation about those pieces, mostly because it's an invitation to come and experience the community. This is what it's like for me. This is my personal experience of Unitarian Universalism. as a definition. Another way that I hear us talking about Unitarian Universalism is to talk about us as an interfaith group. We say, well, there's a diversity of perspectives here. There are pagans and Christians and Jews and atheists and agnostics and transcendentalists and Native Americans and people who go with process theology and spirituality of all kinds of different shapes and forms. One of the ways this is also articulated is to say Unitarian Universalism is not really its own theological perspective. It is a group of many theological perspectives. We could even go so far in this way of answering the question to say we're not even one religion. We're a respectful interfaith group of many religious perspectives. What binds us is our being in community, not any theological piece to this. Now, I would take issue with some of that nuance because I do believe that Unitarian Universalism is a religion unto itself, and that we do have a history, a culture, a theological base. So this perspective, I think, is can be taken to a little bit of an extreme in a way that I don't find helpful, but I've heard people use this method to describe what Unitarian Universalism is, so I wanted to include it in my list. This is not an exhaustive list of 7 styles. This is just the 7 prominent styles that I've seen over the years in my conversations with folks. The next one is also fairly common for me to use, especially when I'm talking with other ministers, Christian ministers in particular. So people will say, what is Unitarian Universalism? And I'll say, well, we came up out of the Protestant Christian movement in the 15 and 1600s in Europe, when all of the Protestants were taking shape, that we were in that mix as well. And Unitarianism comes from the idea that there is one God, rather than the Trinitarian formula of a 3 in 1. Universalism comes from the universal theology, the universal salvation concept that comes to say that God will not damn anyone to eternal suffering, that all souls will be reunited with God in the end. These are core beliefs that talk about Christian theology, from which where we came from, and that's what those words mean. And so this can be a helpful way to talk about who we have been. And so the struggle is that doesn't quite define who we are now. Most people in Unitarian Universalist circles believe in something other than one God. There are people who believe in one God, but maybe not, or one unifying holiness, or they believe there is no God as an atheist or a humanist, or they believe in the plurality of gods and goddesses as a pagan. So I mean that it isn't a defining characteristic to say that we're Unitarian in that theological sense. And to say we're Universalist is not exactly accurate anymore either, because many people don't believe in the realities of a literal heaven or hell. And so the concept of salvation is shifted to kind of an inclusivism, a theology of inclusion that isn't, strictly speaking, what the early Universalists were talking about, but is a natural outcome of an evolving faith into who we are today. So the historical overview might be helpful for people who are interested in the history of Christian thought to know where we fit into the categories. But in and of itself, it doesn't tell you anything about who we are today. Another method, which is sort of the basis of this whole session, this whole series of videos that we've been doing, is to talk about our theology. This one is a little tricky when you're talking with someone outside of Unitarian Universalism, because most Christians want to know what is the theology, what are your beliefs. And so it may not be helpful give them an answer to say, well, we believe in, original blessing rather than original sin. We believe that all souls are blessed by the holy, by God, that we have this radical understanding of human nature, that we are capable of good. We are capable to choose good. And we have this cosmology of an interconnectedness, that we have an epistemology that says we can know truth by our personal experience and by the use of reason, that we have a vision for the world, a beloved community, that these are theological statements, these are belief statements that are valid and you can talk about them, but one of the things I would caution you against is giving somebody who's wanting to know what are our beliefs these statements, because then they might mistake that as our creed, as our statement of shared theological affirmation, and that's not exactly what this is. This is a description of the theology that is a running thread throughout our history and throughout our variety, but it's a description, not a proscription. There's no statement that everybody must agree with each of these theological points, and so it gets a little tricky to step into some of this. But it is a way that it's done. It is a method that you can use to talk about the theology, talk about what is Unitarian Universalism. It has a theology that is progressive and liberal and open. We talk about affirming people. We talk about everyone being included. We talk about theologies that speak of the beloved community. Much of what we've been talking about throughout these videos is captured in this piece. The next one, which is one of my favorite ways of talking about Unitarian Universalism, is to say that we're covenanted seekers. I like this one because it affirms that we're seekers. We're all looking. There's a yearning that is inside the heart of every person to find meaning, to understand what's going on and how they fit, how I connect with the world. And so we're seekers after meaning, after joy, after values that hold us close. We're covenanted, which is a way of saying that we promise to share this journey together. We're covenanted as a piece to say we're also willing to be challenged by someone else's perspective who is in relationship with me in goodwill. And so it's how we do this individual in community tension. We talk about seekers and we talk about covenant in a way that allows for the religious conversation to be shared in community, but to honor that each person has their own path that they're walking. Now, we're a church where you can believe as you must, as your conscience demands, and to share with other people, to hear how other people's consciences are demanding of them to move forward with health and with joy. The final one that I'll offer, the seventh of the ways that I've heard people talk about what is Unitarian Universalism, is to make a real distinction, especially when someone says, what do you use believe? You can say we're not about beliefs, but what we have instead are shared values. We do have theology and beliefs, but what's really at the heart of Unitarian Universalism are some key shared values, such as justice and respect, tolerance and freedom of conscience, the use of reason and the potential for human goodness, democracy, all of these different pieces that are so key, gratitude, the ways in which we interact with the world and lift up the pieces that matter to us, our values. In just about any Unitarian Universalist congregation, you can find different theologies. You can go to a congregation where they're predominantly pagan, or they have a liturgy that's very Christian. But all of them, I would argue, have some underlying, unifying, shared values. of how we are together, who we are together, and what we promote into the world. So Unitarian Universalism is more a community of values than a community of beliefs, which goes back to something that I had said right at the very beginning in that first video. It's not so much a religion about beliefs as a religion that is a way of life, of how to live well. This is a statement of our values, that values are at the center for us. So here's this list. I will admit that I've put them in a ranking order of my own personal preference. And so that I offer you that as a way of saying, if you don't rank them that way, that's fine. What I'd like to be able to say is that each of these ways of saying what is Unitarian Universalist has something to offer. And in many ways, what matters most is who's asking this question. Who are you in conversation with? Is the person challenging you to try and uncover your heresy and how you're wrong? Is the person trying to convert you? Or is the person you're in conversation with curious, yearning to know something more about this religion that you're a part of because it matters to you, and so they want to know a little bit more about it? Or maybe it matters to them because they are looking for this. And if you can offer it to them in a way that helps them see an opening for them, so who you're talking to makes a big difference in which of these strategies you might use to define Unitarian Universalism, remembering that it's complex. There isn't one way to say what it is. There's a multitude of ways in to this community. So let me offer just a brief digression. Reverend Galen Gingrich put an article out into the UU World several years back now, in which he shared a story of his daughter who was out on the playground. She was young, and she was having conversations with some of her friends. Some of them were Jewish, some of them were Christian, and they were saying, well, this is what my religion does. This is what it means to be Jewish or Christian. And the question came to her, what do Unitarian Universalists believe? What is that? Her father, in considering this question, said, Unitarian Universalism's prevailing view insists on our freedom to believe whatever we want. I asked my very own daughter what Unitarians believe, and her answer was orthodox to a fault. Zoe replied, we believe whatever we want to believe. This answer is not good enough, and it certainly doesn't work on the playground. It's as if your daughter's friend asked, where do you live? And she responded, I am free to live wherever I want. Have you ever bumped into this statement that when you're defining what is Unitarian Universalism, the answer comes out, we believe whatever we want. We can believe anything we want. One of the counters that I've offered a couple of different times throughout these videos is to turn that phrase a little bit and say, Unitarian Universalists can believe as they must. Not whatever they want, but as their conscience demands of them. So, how might we offer something like that to children? Most of the answers that we offer ourselves as adults, when we really dig in and try and sort through and come up with a solution as to how do we answer that question, they're big and abstract and lots of $20 words. It's not all that helpful for our children. And so I would suggest that not only do we need to come up with our own answers, we also need to come up with playground answers. So my own answers might be, we're a community of covenanted seekers, affirming the freedom of religious conscience within every person. But that would be hard for a child to repeat, let alone understand. We look at all the world's scriptures for inspiration and preach tolerance of differences. historically, Unitarians reject the doctrine of the Trinity, while Universalists reject the doctrine of universal damnation. I mean, these are some of the ways in which I just described how to do it well. And yet, for children, it won't work. These are not answers that will work on the playground for a 10-year-old. We're an evolving faith that boldly declares that new light is ever awaiting to break into our understanding. I mean, that's ringing poetry, but it doesn't travel across the swing set. So, I've spent some time trying to imagine, what would we have our children say? What ought we give to them to be able to answer this question, what is Unitarianism? And if we recognize the validity of James Fowler's assertion that faith is a developmental process, just like you have physical development and cognitive development and emotional development, you have faith development. So it's something that occurs in developmental stages. Fowler talked about stages of faith development. And he said that children need to come at these concepts of faith differently at different ages. And so, can we come up with ways that our children can answer the question that is not as nuanced and complex as the answers we adults might give, and yet is still love our neighbors as ourselves, is one of the ways that I've offered children to say. We believe that we can each search for the truth. These are some of the statements that might work for some of the kids. We believe that we're all God's children. We promise to treat all people fairly. Some of these I've phrased as we promise. Some of them I've left as we believe. Even though Unitarian Universalists don't all believe the same thing, children benefit from having something solid and concrete to work from. And so while there's inaccuracies in these, and I'm not saying that you should take this list and go use it, but I'm offering these as some examples as starter points. If you are working in your religious education program at your church, or if you have children in your family, in your life, to think about how children might answer the question in a way that they understand and in a way that is still accurate. Something more than just we can believe anything we want, but instead to say we believe it's okay to be different. In fact, we're supposed to each be different, and that we promise to try to make the world a better place. That's an accurate statement, and it's a way we are, and a distinctive piece of Unitarian Universalism. What are the ways in which you have answered the question, what is Unitarian Universalism? Have you found for yourself any of the prevalent answers that I've offered that are ways in which you've answered the question? Do you see yourself in any of these styles, or in some of the conversation around how children offer it? So our conversation around building our shared theology. We have spent time talking about Unitarian Universalist theological plurality, and I am emphasizing the concept of plurality, that there isn't a single unifying core theology. It's the plurality that is the point. And so the very first video that I offered you was all about how we engage in the plurality, that we talk about how each person has a perspective, each among us has a way of knowing and a path that we're following, and that's a key piece of what it means to be Unitarian Universalists, what we value. The video that I put out talked about the 7 principles, and I uncovered theology that I saw underneath those 7 principles, linked them with some of the concepts of Christian theology that are out there, because Unitarian Universalism came up out of Christianity. But that's not all the theology that's there. That's just the theology that's hidden underneath those 7 principles. And one of the things that I really tried to articulate in that next session was that theology is not the core defining piece at the middle of the table to define Unitarian Universalism. It is instead something on the table. We have something else at our core. We do have core theology, but theology is not our core. So I want that to be a clear distinction that helps us in navigating. It's one of those nuances that's not going to work on the playground, but it's important to work for yourself when you're thinking about what's your experience here in the congregation, what's your understanding of universalism. The next session that I had led was around theological labels, and we talked about pagans and theists and humanists, Buddhists that are around nowadays in Buddhist practice, and so how these theological labels are becoming less and less prevalent among us because they always ever were only starting points to get into the conversation for what it's like. The labels are like when we use the analogy of a thumbprint. The label might say there's a swirl here or lines and ridges over there, but each person's print is unique, and that's the part that we want to know about. The theological label can be of value as a starting point to say, here's some similarities that I and others that I'm in conversation with have, but here's the really interesting thing about my own experiences and my own beliefs. The next session that I offered was about covenant. And so if theology is not, strictly speaking, at our core, I would say covenant is how we are together, that promise of how we're going to treat each other, how we're going to encourage each other and challenge each other, that's the piece that is our binding element. That covenant brings us forward into the future because it allows us to evolve, it allows us to change over the years, but it also holds us together. The session that I offered just before this one, I talked about how our theology can lead us to act in the world in certain ways. It is the root of our justice making. It is why we behave in certain ways. Faith without works is dead, and so but works without faith is groundless. And so to really uncover your theology and your beliefs so that you know why it matters to you, that you will travel to a picket line or you will go across to meet with other people who would be labeled different or other or untouchable. What is the Unitarian Universalist efforts around standing on the side of love with immigration and with gay marriage? It's rooted in a theology. And so knowing what that theology is was a key piece of that message that we talked about the last time we had a video. In today's session, I think one of the pieces that I would hope to lift up most strongly is that the greatest value of this conversation is that it's a conversation. And so discovering for yourself what you believe, building your own theology, is of value for you because you need to know what your theology is so that you can then reach out and engage with others. And that is the real beauty of Unitarian Universalism. Draws you up out of your own perspective, your own theology, and brings you out into community, into conversation with others.